My name is Terrence Barkin. I'm the Executive Director of the Advanced Carbons Council, and together with Wiley Law, we are hosting today's webinar on TSCA exemptions for nanocarbon materials. This would cover things like graphene and carbon nanotubes. For those of you who are not familiar with the Advanced Carbons Council, we started back in 2013 as the Graphene Council, and this year expanded our mandate to cover all forms of engineered carbons. So that would include carbon nanotubes, buckyballs, graphene, but also macro scale carbon materials like synthetic graphite, carbon fiber, etc. We are very pleased to be able to do this session today together with Wiley Law, presented by an extremely competent expert in the field, Dr. Alex Stanton, who is a former employee of EPA and now with Wiley Law, and with whom we have worked with over the past several years about regulatory compliance issues for nanomaterials under the EPA and the TSCA regulations. And with that, I'd love to hand over to Alex. Please note that the video is not working for Alex, so she will be off screen, but you will certainly benefit from her expertise in the presentation that you're about to see. And so with that, Alex, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Terrence. I appreciate that. And indeed, as my video is not working, I'd like everyone to just imagine that I look a little bit like Brooke Shields if she was a chemist, and just keep that super beautiful image in your mind. No need to worry about what I actually look like. Thank you all for coming here to learn about exemptions. As Terrence said, we've had a long and very positive working relationship for several years now, and I'm sure many of you acknowledge and are appreciative of Terrence's leadership and expertise in this field and the amount of advocacy he does to get nanocarbon materials into US commerce, which is a goal of all of us. Now that I am at a law firm, I have to do the disclaimer that basically, this is not legal advice. I am not a lawyer. Things that we're talking about here today it's a collegial discussion to give you helpful information and to guide questions that you may ask in the future. It is not to be quoted in media, and it's considered, off the record. So let's chat. You have potentially a new chemical. You're working on some kind of nanocarbon and you want it to enter US commerce and you're not sure what to do first. So it's a TSCA chemical because it is not in these other categories of drugs, tobacco, nuclear materials, munitions. It's not used for food additives or food contact materials. It's not used in cosmetics, and it's not used solely as a pesticide. So in that sense, what you're theoretically manufacturing or importing here is a traditional industrial commercial chemical, and you intend it to have a traditional industrial commercial use in the US. It's not something that you're manufacturing just for export. It's not a naturally occurring substance, and you're not talking about an article. So you don't have a yoga mat. You're talking about making yoga mats, as an example. That's how you know you're under TSCA. So you know that you are going to manufacture or import something. You know it is a TSCA chemical. Where are you going to go first? The first place you're going to go is the TSCA chemical inventory. This background I'm just going to give because I think it's important to set the scene. Most of this is not actually going to be super applicable to you, but the TSCA chemical inventory was originally published in 1979. It captured 62,000 chemicals used in the US at that time. It was, kind of a survey and an inventory of what is in the US, what is being used under TSCA uses at that time. And that's then what we called our existing chemicals. They're chemicals on the inventory. The inventory is then updated regularly as new chemicals are manufactured or imported into the US. So, something that is not on the inventory, but we are going to use, we then add to the inventory. So now some, 40 years later, we're at roughly 86,000 chemicals. You'll notice that EPA is very into using the phrase chemical substance and not chemicals. And that's That is in the law, but one of the like more thoughtful scientific reasons to think about this is because the EPA knew they were taking an inventory and sort of a survey of how a substance is represented to them. So are these 86,000 unique chemicals? Probably not, right? The EPA only knows what's being represented to them, and some of that is limited by information that the manufacturer or importer has, or potentially by even like the instrumentation and sensitivity available to somebody. So some of these substances that were on the inventory in the 1970s or 1980s, as our instrumentation and characterization techniques have gotten better, people have realized, wow, I named this chemical something, I represented it one way to the EPA, but now I've realized I was actually incorrect. I wasn't, sensitive enough or thorough enough. So that's where it gets kind of tricky, and that's why they use that term substance instead of just chemicals. So before something is added to the inventory and becomes an existing chemical in U.S. commerce, EPA is required to assess and manage risk, both to human health and the environment, from those chemicals before they enter commerce. So the idea, of course, is that every time a chemical substance enters commerce, there should not be risk to human health or the environment. Obviously, that would be a perfect world, which we do not live in, but that's the goal. That's what EPA is working towards. The TSCA chemical inventory is mostly public. I've linked it there. So the chemical identity can be claimed as CBI, this confidential business information, so that only a generic name is published. So, potentially instead of being very specific about, I have this mixed metal oxide with this percentage of manganese and this percentage of cobalt and this percentage of whatever, you might just say, mixed metal oxide, manganese, cobalt, whatever. So it allows you to claim certain parts of that to yourself as confidential, keeping a market advantage. But interestingly, only a small percentage of the inventory is confidential. Most of it is public. So you can look at, I think it's like 80% of the inventory at any time is available to you with full chemical names and CAS numbers where applicable. So as we mentioned, substances get added to the inventory as existing chemicals after EPA's review of them as new chemicals is complete. So the submitting company, so you've submitted your chemical for review to EPA, they say that is okay, you may enter commerce. You, as the company, then have to provide back a notice of commencement, an NOC, within 30 days of that first manufacture or import to get your chemical added to the inventory. That is an important step that actually a lot of companies fail to do, which is interesting. So though around 400 substances are commenced each year and added to the inventory, not every PMN chemical is commenced. And this is a little subtle, but basically, like, if you as the submitting company go through your review and get approval for your chemical to enter commerce, you do not submit this NOC because maybe you never actually manufacture it for whatever reason. And then, for example, your company gets bought by someone else and you get to make a lot of money and you go off into the beach and you're having a great life. That new company cannot submit the NOC on your behalf. They can't commence it. They have to resubmit for a second review for it to then be applicable to them. So that takes a huge amount of EPA time and resources, and it's very expensive and annoying for everybody. So this is my little moment to you. If you ever are in this position, submit your notice of commencement. Make as little as you need to just make sure that you've made or imported a little bit and get it on the inventory. The inventory is published 2 to 3 times a year, depending on the year, mostly twice, sometimes 3 times. There will be no exempted chemicals on the inventory, which makes intuitive sense, but I think is important to still emphasize that if you say, I am exempt from a full new chemical review for whatever reason, and we'll talk about those in a second, obviously you're not going to then be a chemical that gets to go in the inventory because you weren't fully reviewed. You didn't become an existing chemical. So I think that's also just keep that in mind. You will not end up on the inventory if you use an exemption. All right, so you go to the public inventory and you say, I know I'm a TSCA chemical because I am going to have a TSCA use. I'm looking at this inventory. I don't see my chemical on it. How do I know? How am I looking to see if my chemical is on it or not, to see if I'm an existing chemical or a new chemical? Well, it's all about the name. So naming conventions exist for both class 1 and class 2 substances. So a class 1 substance is a very, definitive structure. So it's the same every single time. There's no variation. You can draw it. That's going to be things like, acetone or vitamin A. It's always the same. There's often a stereochemistry associated with it, things like this. That's obviously great for some chemicals, but other chemicals are a little trickier. So either they have they don't have a definitive chemical structure for whatever reason. Maybe sometimes they're like a mixture of different variations of chemicals or a distribution of size, for example. And these are class 2 substances, so they're described a little bit differently. These are often called UVCBs, so chemicals with unknown, variable, complex, or biological structures. That can't just be called vitamin A. They have to be called, something else a little bit broader. So to understand what your proper chemical name is and what your CAS registry number might be, if that's applicable, it's best to go through CAS Inventory Expert Services. They are very fast and they are not very expensive and they are very excellent at their jobs. Proper chemical names acquired through CAS IES will be accepted by EPA. Now, you don't have to use them, but then you start getting into some of the issues we talked about earlier with how you represent the substance versus how maybe EPA would represent the substance, and that can cause a disparity in name, and that's not what you want. Unfortunately for almost everybody here, some substances do not have naming conventions or CAS numbers. That's going to be true for carbon nanotubes and graphene. And you might say, but Alex, I have seen a CAS number for graphene. It exists on the internet. I can Google it right now. And that is true, but that is sort of a generic CAS number, and EPA would not accept that as applying to your specific graphene because they consider your graphene to not be generic. It's specific to you. You've given them information about what exactly your graphene has, how you made it, what the size differentials are, if there's any leftover catalyst, things like this. They end up mattering for the chemical identity because they consider them to be these class 2 UVCBs. So those kinds of details would go into the name, so it wouldn't be generically graphene. It would be a lot more specific than that. So this is very challenging for everybody, and it's challenging on an international level. I want to make that clear. Nobody's having fun at all with this issue, but everybody is working on it. There's a huge amount of effort internationally by IUPAC, and here Terrence and the Advanced Carbons Council, they're working on getting standards, at least national standards, which will hopefully be elevated to international standards for naming conventions for both graphene and I think even carbon nanotubes. Everybody's interested in this. I encourage you heavily to join this effort. None of us are as smart as all of us. So the more that we can say this is important and we have to settle this, the better it'll be for everybody. Also, once a naming convention is set, we can start getting consistent chemical names for everybody's carbon nanomaterials, which is what we want because then those can be added to the inventory. The high level of this is because there's no official proper chemical nomenclature for carbon nanomaterials. When they are named, those names can't be added to the inventory because they're like temporary. They're placeholder names. So all of these carbon nanomaterials are considered new, not on the inventory, because of this nomenclature issue. It's a huge, huge deal, and it makes everyone else's lives very expensive because all of the chemicals are then new and have to be submitted for review by EPA. So that's just like the essentially philosophical hole that is the weird intersection of chemistry and law, of what's in a name. It's just hell, but we're gonna get through it, and the more help we get, the better. So you have named your chemical, potentially on your own, hopefully with the help of CAS IES. You've checked the inventory, which you now know does not have any useful information for you if you're a carbon nanomaterial. And you say, okay, I'm not on the inventory. I have this chemical intended for TSCA use. I have to submit it for review by EPA so that it can enter commerce. Your immediate option are PMNs, which we're not going to talk about very much. I believe there was a 2023 talk with the former Graphene Council that I think is still on the Advanced Carbons Council's YouTube, where Jim Allwood from EPA and myself did a talk about submitting pre-manufacture notices for graphene. You can watch that if you are curious about the process in more depth. That is available to you. But the high level is that a PMN is a thorough review of your carbon nanomaterial. The statutory clock is 90 days, which is normally spread out over a year or two. So it takes a while. It is an expensive review. So if you're a small business, it's this, $6,480. But if you're not a small business, it's $37,000 per submission. You have to submit quite a bit of information. One, you're required by law to submit all the information that you have, but also lots of information, obviously, about the chemical identity, the production volume, byproducts, use, environmental release, disposal practices, human exposure. And there's going to be a very thorough review by EPA to look at risks, potential risks, to human health and the environment by your chemical. The thing that gets people is that it's not just about how you intend to use your chemical. EPA is also going to assess known and reasonably foreseen uses of your chemical, which for carbon nanomaterials, we all know they can be used in a lot of different ways. I can use a graphene without struggling. I can think of 20 ways that I could use graphene. So even though you as the submitter might say, I only intend to use this in, one EV batteries. That's great. We love EV batteries. Do that. EPA will say it is known that this chemical substance could be used in other ways, either because they know that from patents or literature, or there's been other PMN submissions that tell them this, or it's reasonably foreseen based on the structure, use, or analogs, how even though nobody's used it in this one way, it's reasonably foreseen that it could be used in that way. And EPA is going to assess the risks in all of those situations. So that's why it becomes this kind of drawn out, complex, expensive, long review, just to make sure there is no risk to human health or the environment. That is a little bit overwhelming just to think about. EPA has published a lot of guidance and policy documents on this so that you can try to parse through it and understand everything. I know Terrence and the Advanced Carbons Council, they can also help you with PMN submissions. They are very good at that. But this would be something that I would say if this is an appropriate way for you to have your chemical enter commerce, seek help. Don't try to do it on your own. There's a lot going on. I've mentioned a few things here. You can have a pre-notice consultation before you submit anything to EPA. They will talk to you. It is free. You can say, here's kind of what my questions are. Here's my plan. They can guide you. That's very helpful for especially understanding how you're going to phrase the chemical identity or think about the chemical identity and what kind of data they might be looking for. I also mentioned these TSCA engineering rework presentations. There's 3 webinars online. That's very helpful because the way that EPA thinks about human exposure is non-intuitive, and just being a good industrial hygienist will not help you think about it in the way that EPA is going to think about it. So they've published this, so you can just see what their models look like and what common issues they encounter. Sustainable futures, I'm going to throw this out there. The actual point of sustainable futures is no longer applicable post-Lautenberg. TSCA was amended in 2016 by the Lautenberg amendments, and so that's no longer applicable. But the point is, for this prior project called Sustainable Futures, EPA did publish all of their tools and models on their website, which they keep up to date. And you can just go see what kind of tools and models they're using to assess different scenarios so that you will not be surprised. And that's the important part about what Sustainable Futures has to offer you. So anyway, you've looked over this stuff and you're like, this seems expensive and long and scary, and I'm not sure that I need quite that level of review for my chemical substance. It's just not, I'm not trying to save the world with carbon nanotubes. I have a specific use in mind. I'd like to see if there's a smaller scale option for me to get my chemical reviewed by EPA. So there's 4 exemptions we're going to talk about today. So when we say exemptions, we mean they're exempt from that pre-manufacture notice. So exempt from a Section 5 full review. And again, that would mean your chemical will not go on the TSCA chemical inventory after these reviews or lack thereof, because they didn't get the full review. But there's 4 ways that you can still kind of get either, we'll just say approval or buy-in from EPA to have your chemical enter the market. So the first exemption we'll talk about is a low volume exemption. So you're saying, I don't want to make very much of my chemical. I'm not trying to make, 10 million kilograms. I'd like to make 10,000 kilograms or less per year. So LVEs have a shorter review time. It's 30 days on the statutory clock, which of course really means 6 to 9 months. It is less expensive, so I've given the full and the small business prices there. And basically, the way that EPA is able to do this shorter review is not just because you have limited your volume, because, lots of chemicals still require PMNs, even though they're a low volume. But basically, you are legally binding yourself to the conditions of use described in the submission. So that way, EPA does not have to consider known conditions of use or reasonably foreseen conditions of use. They get to skip both of those huge steps. They only have to look at you doing exactly what you said you're going to do. So obviously there's a different, I would say, legal requirement at the end of this that you can't change what you said you're going to do. If you said, I'm going to make 200 kilograms of graphene every year, max, and I'm going to use it in one specific use, that is your use and that is your volume. You can't say, well, this year I'm going to make 205 because we got an extra order at the end for Christmas and I want people to be able to use it. No, you already said I'm only making this amount. And you can't say, well, as like a side project, I wanted to use it in whatever, pen ink, and now I also want to use it in pencils. No, you said pen ink, so you can only do that. So if you're going to go down this path, you have to be extremely thoughtful and strategic with what you're writing down, because you will be completely bound to those conditions. You cannot vary. So LVEs, in addition to these volume requirements, they have hazard restrictions. So for a chemical to be eligible for an LVE exemption, you cannot have serious acute or chronic health effects, and you cannot have any significant environmental effects. This gets a little tricky for nanomaterials because nanomaterials typically have limited aquatic toxicity information associated with them. And many of them, not all, but many of them have some known human health hazards. So especially with that kind of unknown aquatic toxicity, the question about whether or not there's significant environmental effects or not becomes really important. And EPA gets a little bit nervous about granting you this exemption if they don't if they're not confident, right? So if you're going to go down this path and submit a low volume exemption, normally the points to really focus on are exposure information and intended use. So if you had we'll just say carbon nanotube, that was going to be a site limited intermediate. You were going to basically briefly make it, but it wasn't going to be processed anywhere else. Maybe it stays in the same exact pot that it's in. You just hold it for a little while and then you process it into something else on site. That might be better because you have very limited exposure. And as everyone knows, when you're considering risk, the hazard is an important part, but the exposure is an equivalently important part. So doing as much as you can to talk about the exposure is very important. And equivalently, the no exposure, if you have something that whatever, for some reason it doesn't ever touch air, and you're able to convince EPA this will never ever touch air, and we don't release any of it to water, things like this, then you might have a good argument for why your chemical substance would be a fit for an LVE. So relatedly, and I would say equivalently strenuously, there are low REX exemptions. So low REX have a lot of the same logistical parts as LVEs. So you still have this 30-day-ish review period, which is, again, 6 to 9 months probably. It is still cheaper than a PMN. But unlike with an LVE, there's no limit on the production volume. So you can make as much of this as you want. The point is that it's going to have basically no releases and no exposures. And absolutely basically no consumer releases or exposures in particular. We don't want any consumer exposures for this one. So because, again, it's like related to the LVE, right, where we talked about you probably want to try to find ways to limit your exposures. Here, EPA actually is very clear about what they consider to be the eligibility criteria for what low exposure and low release are. They have a lot of information. I've just copied this from the rule, but EPA, of course, is even more thorough in many other policy documents about this. So it's pretty specific, and it can be very arduous to meet these conditions, especially if you don't have a lot of information on your manufacturing and processing. Maybe you only control the manufacturing site and someone else controls the processing site, things like this. It can be very hard to get the amount of information that you need to prove that this is true. But if you can, it's a really excellent way to make a huge amount of material and not have to go through quite so many steps as you would in a PMN. So basically gives you the volume of a PMN and the abbreviated review of an LVE. All right, the test market exemption. So this is a little bit different. This is basically your attempt to see if a customer will accept your chemical substance and what the probable demand for that product would be if it was competing with other goods. So what you're saying to EPA is, I think that I want to make this chemical, and I want to make it for these uses, and I want to make a lot of it in the future, and I think it's going to be great, but because the market is, I don't know, so flooded with nanocarbon materials, I'm not 100% confident that mine is going to outcompete everyone else's. And before I spend all this money on a PMN, I'd like to just see how it goes if I make a little bit of it and send it out into the world. So it's a slightly longer review period. It's 45 days, which again, honestly, probably 9 to 12 months. These are, it takes a while. But it's a good way to get your product out there just to start. So you do have to emphasize and demonstrate that your chemical substance is not going to present an unreasonable risk either to humans or to the environment as a result of your test marketing activities. And you have to be pretty specific in your application. So, you can only, it's test market, so you should know the amount that you're intending to make or process. And you should know what customers you're interested in acquiring. So like, who are you going to be sending this material to? And again, all of this is basically to reassure EPA that you're doing this in good faith. You're doing this with the intention that, should your substance be accepted by the customers, you would submit a pre-manufacture notice so that you could distribute more fully in commerce. You're not trying to skirt the PMN requirements by submitting a TME. A TME and a PMN can be submitted simultaneously for this purpose, but EPA considers those reviews separately. And if they feel like you're trying to use the TME to enter the market early before your PMN review is completed, they'll just deny your TME. So you have to use it for its appropriate and intended use, which makes sense. So they're very time limited, and they're very quantity limited, and they're very customer limited. But on a interesting note, there's no set application form for a TME. So it's more of a thorough letter that you might write to EPA explaining what you intend to do and how much and how long, and how you know that you will not be causing unreasonable risk to human health and the environment by these activities. So those are all fun, but now we get into the real exemption, which is the research and development one. So R&D is an incredibly powerful exemption because there's no review period. You're not submitting any notice to EPA that you're doing research and development. That part is intuitive. You know that when you see a grad student in lab making a weird new chemical, they're not telling EPA about it in advance. They're doing research and development, right? So this exemption, it's basically to allow manufacturers to bring in or manufacture a chemical substance for research and development activities, as long as you, the manufacturer or importer, notifies everybody associated with those R&D activities of any risk to health, and that you have a technically competent person handling the material or supervising other people who are handling the material. So again, there's no notice, so you're not waiting for EPA to approve anything, and you don't have to spend any money on that submission, which is great. Now, EPA does have an Office of Enforcement and Compliance, OECA, and they do inspect facilities. And so if they've come to your facility and they see that you are making a lot of chemicals and you don't have any PMNs and you didn't apply for any exemptions, and you say, well, it's all R&D, don't worry about it, and they don't believe you because you maybe weren't being genuine about it, or you didn't have the records to back it up, which we'll talk about in a minute, that's going to be up to $50,000 per day of violation and up to 1 year in prison. So it is something that, again, can be quite free or quite expensive if you do it wrong. So that's something that you want to be thorough about if you're going to do it. R&D is broader than people think it is. I have copied this language directly from this bulletin that came out on the EPA put this out on the R&D and TME exemption. I want to say in like the 80s or 90s. It is on their website where I said that they have the TSCA resources. It is there. So this is copied from their words. So R&D, obviously, scientific experimentation, research, analysis. So that includes synthesis, analysis, experimentation, and research on new or existing chemical substances that you're using in new ways. The focus should be on the chemical and physical characteristics, the performance, or the production characteristics of the substance, a mixture containing the substance, or even an article at the end. So that starts broadening out, but it gets even broader than that. Again, directly copied from their bulletin. You can do R&D in a laboratory, which is I think what most people think of, but also a pilot plant or even a commercial plant, or at whatever site is appropriate. So yes, some of this will be chemical synthesis and, PChem testing. Some of it might be health and environmental effects testing, but some of it could also involve production in like a full-scale commercial run. Like if you made a new chemical and you need to know if you can produce it at commercial scale, you might end up being able to, make, if it's appropriate for your test, 1,000,000 kilograms of it to see if it works in your facilities, right? Like, can your setup handle that chemical? Or maybe you made a brand new plant for this brand new chemical, and you need to get everything up to speed and up to spec and working at once. So again, it is some things you think of intuitively, like that synthesis or efficacy and performance testing, but also bigger things like full-scale production or even consumer panel testing of the performance characteristics. All of that is R&D. So when we copied the language from the rule, they said manufacture, import in small quantities, but EPA is clear that they're not going to quantitatively define what small is. It should be to scale of what the R&D activity is. So if you're just doing, a little synthesis, yeah, maybe you don't need to make 1,000,000 kilograms of it to be appropriate for your activity. But if you are testing your plant's capabilities, some of these biofuel companies, for example, to see if everything works, it'll be hundreds of thousands or 1,000,000 kilograms. It also depends on what your use is. If you're making a dye, it's going to be pretty hard to convince EPA that, you needed to make 50,000 kilograms of it, when most of the time, a couple hundred kilograms might have been more appropriate. So, relatedly, manufacturers can sell their R&D materials for exclusively R&D purposes. So if you make 1,000,000 kilograms of something, you're making a mixed metal oxide for whatever reason. You've made it, and now it's going to go into car batteries. But your only job was to make the mixed metal oxide. You've made a lot of it. You can sell it to the car battery manufacturer for them to actually incorporate into a battery to see if it's going to work for their cars. And you can make money from that. That's fine. So the exemption itself, the rule, it has very specific record keeping requirements, which you can read about. They are thorough and very boring. But manufacturers should also be prepared to justify the nature and the scope of their activities should EPA inspectors show up. So I really suggest that, one, this is a really broad umbrella of an exemption for nanocarbon manufacturers to use, and you should use it. You should use that umbrella, but you should be very thorough and clear in having a research and development plan, if you can, about what you're testing, why you're testing it, what you're looking for, how you know if you've achieved it, why you have to make the amounts that you're making, and what tests each amount will be going to, what you're going to do with it afterwards. If you sell it, how much is being sold to which person, these sorts of things. That is the, that is going to be how you know that you're not going to get in trouble with the EPA should they show up. Again, you don't need to tell them this in advance. You never send your plan to them. But if they show up and you didn't have any of this written down, it's going to be a mad scramble to get it. And you don't want that. You want to be thoroughly prepared. You want to have all of your ducks in a row. I'll just summarize this real quick. LVEs, so that's your low volume exemption. Again, it can be quite applicable depending on your use. If you're only making a little, you're not really moving sites, for example, it can be a good fit for you, but it tends to be very difficult to get approved if any powder handling is involved. That is our experience with EPA. If you go through and look through any of the documents EPA's put out about how they do their assessments, they're very sensitive to powder handling. And because of the less well-characterized human health hazards from a lot of nanocarbon materials, they would consider that often to be too serious or unknown of a human health risk. And so it'd be challenging to get that approved for an LVE. Low REXs are less common because, as we said, they're more arduous in the terms that you have to meet to prove that you have, low release and low exposure. But if you have like a fully enclosed system throughout and you don't release to wastewater, it's a better option than people think it is, and I don't believe it is as thoroughly considered as it should be for many uses. Test marketing is probably not for you. It is traditionally used for direct-to-consumer products, which I don't know a lot of you have, but if you do, it exists and it's an option, and it's something that you should at least look into and see if it would be a good fit for you or not. Again, you don't want to necessarily spend any extra time or money if you know you're going to have to end up with a PMN no matter what. But if you don't know that, you're not confident you have to end up with a PMN, then starting with a test market exemption is not bad. And then the R&D exemption is a critically important exemption, and I encourage, where appropriate, that it be used for as long as possible, as long as you're willing to keep really thorough, excellent records. That is not the time to be stingy on your lab notebooks. Every part of that should be very well documented, and that can be an excellent umbrella for you to work under until you get a PMN through, or if until you determine that a PMN is necessary, right? So in summary, exemptions can save time, exemptions can save money and resources. Exempt substances are not listed on the TSCA chemical inventory, but often good to still check the inventory and just make sure. Exemptions can be used while you wait for your PMN. You can do research and development activities while you apply for a PMN. You can do test market exemptions. You can do exemptions while you go through that 1 to 2 years of PMN review. And they all have record keeping requirements, but on your end, I think just really internalizing that and going above and beyond on your record keeping will only be a good thing. Again, PMNs take many months. If you do think to yourself, I'm going to have to do a PMN, please file early. That statutory 90 days, like I said, it is spread out over 1 to 2 years. They have suspensions of the clock that they do so that they never exceed that 90 days, but it still chronologically takes a long time. If you have a commercial contract or a schedule that you're trying to adhere to, you need to build that timeline in. One of the main advantages of PMNs is they do not share that same volume limitation for the most part. Some PMNs are volume limited, but most are not. That would be a restriction from EPA if they determine that to protect human health and the environment, they have to limit the volume, but that's not as common. PMN substances do get listed on the inventory after you file that NOC, which you're all going to do. And that can be good because a lot of customers actually prefer to see inventory listings. It makes them feel like, reassured that EPA has looked at this chemical substance. So that's something to consider too in your customer base, whether or not that's important to them. It's a great way to learn about your chemical. EPA, like I said, they've done a lot to publish their tools and models, but you almost never know until you do a PMN what is actually going to happen. There can be quite a bit of variability based on your unique substance and your intended use. This is my last little pitch here about what Wiley does with TSCA Section 5. As I said, Terrence and the Advanced Carbons Council, they're very good at helping you submit PMNs or even these exemptions if you decide that you need to go down that route. That is a great resource for you. And then if anything goes wrong, you can come find us. Wiley does a little bit more niche specific TSCA Section 5 work. So a little bit better with, we do more work on the negotiating and, modification requests, issues with SNRs that you might have, issues if you did get inspected and now you're having a problem with your, inspection report. They found issues. If there's self-disclosure that you need, CBI substantiation, things like this. There is a TSCA Resource Center on the Wiley website, which I have linked there. And again, a long and positive relationship with the Advanced Carbons Council. So we're both here to help you with different parts of your process should you choose to go through it. I'll pause there to take some questions.
Excellent. Alex, thank you so much. I think you did a fantastic job of laying down the landscape and looking at all the options that companies have and the different ways that they can go to market as they develop their, in our case, engineered carbons, especially the nanocarbons. And we do have a number of questions here. I'll kind of go in order, and we'll see if we have a few minutes here. First question was about a submitter that said in the past they were told by EPA that for single wall carbon nanotubes they could use a particular CAS numbers, the 740-44-0 as a reference. But as you had mentioned, I think as we also have experience from our side, the CAS numbers are not mature or fit for use at the moment for these EPA submissions. Is that, how do you comment on that?
Yeah, so when you go to submit either a PMN or an exemption to EPA, you will see that there's a spot for you to put in a CAS number, and the electronic system really wants you to put in a CAS number there. It is very focused on that. So we often encourage people, whatever, put a bunch of zeros or put the generic, as you said, kind of CAS number for single walled or graphene, whatever is most appropriate. The important thing is that EPA is not going to actually associate that with your chemical. It's sort of just to overcome this electronic hurdle. So the EPA knows that CAS number is not representative of your substance, and they will not include it going forward. It's just an overcoming issue.
Thank you. And that's something we are working on as well with the Advanced Carbons Council. And we have a standards group working on an ASTM numbering system, which doesn't replace this, but it also with the CAS numbering system, we are engaged in talking with them about how to address this issue so we can get proper CAS numbers. There's a question here, which is quite a good one. It says, does my liability for LVE extends to my client's intended use? And I think we could expand that out. For example, with PMNs, and you get a consent letter that tells you some compliance things for application or restriction on use. Can you just talk a little bit about the extension of liability from the submitter to how their clients actually use the chemicals?
Yes, so it's very different for PMNs and LVEs, because for PMNs, if you submit a PMN and EPA says, okay, you can manufacture this with these restrictions, and they put in some restrictions, for example, and you say, thank you, I'll take that, you move on and you manufacture. Basically, it is for a limited period of time. It is your responsibility to communicate those restrictions down to your, for example, processors, right? So you have control over the next level down from you, one level down of distribution. But there will be, for your consent order, a significant new use rule published, because your chemical is going to go onto the TSCA chemical inventory, in theory, right? You've NOC'd it. And for some reason, in this case, we're saying all the CAS numbers and names are fine. And so the SNR, the significant new use rule, is what tells everybody else in the world what not to do with your chemical once it's on the inventory, right? So that everybody is held to the same rules and standards. Once the SNR is published, then you and everybody abide by the terms of the SNR, which is great. And so then everybody kind of has the same responsibility for how to use the chemical. Because LVEs and other exemptions never go on the inventory, they never get SNRs. So normally you can't really distribute your chemical very far. So whatever you're submitting has to be the use that you say it is, right? And then you sign, depending on your situation, right? You're either submitting with your customers' sites and uses in mind, or you're able, depending on the LV and the exact situation, to sign letters of agreement that they adhere to the same terms of the LVE. But normally it's a much more limited distribution, because again, you're limited by volume and use to the things that, and the locations, the sites, the places that you said you were going to make it. So in that sense, if you don't know who your customers are, sometimes an LVE is just really not a great option, and a PMN might be a lot better if you're going to have different customers or different uses in the future.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Another question is about what volume of nanomaterial can a startup manufacture in the early days before a TSCA exemption is required? And I think we might want to address that in a slightly different way, because the R&D exemption you don't request, you operate under it. But can you talk a little bit about volumes of manufacturing and if there are some thresholds?
Yeah, the answer is basically anything you can confidently defend, I would say, in front of someone who is not very scientific. So that is, as you said, where the R&D exemption kind of comes into play. You're a startup, you're not doing anything super firm yet, you're not totally in commerce yet. You are basically, as long as you keep good records, allowed to make as much as you need to complete your research and development activities. You just have to document what activities those are, what are you researching, what are you developing, and account for the volumes that you are making and why those were necessary and where they are going, to make sure that everything is, above board. But, certain uses might require quite a bit more than other uses. So in some situations, you might be making, like I said, hundreds or thousands of kilograms of something under research and development. So there's not really a volume threshold. It should be appropriate to the use and it should be accounted for. That's what I would say. Record keeping.
Thank you, Alex. Our experience, especially with graphene or carbon nanotubes, is the volumes compared to other, let's say, widely used chemicals, the volumes are extremely small in the grand scheme of things. So
absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Here's a very relevant question, because obviously graphene carbon nanotube manufacture takes place all over the world, and the US market's quite an attractive market. So we have a lot of companies that are looking at either importation of their nanomaterial, or they're considering establishing a production facility here, or a distribution, or doing compounding here, or producing finished articles. So the question is it required to be a US-based company in order to prepare a PMN or submit a PMN, or to qualify for the small volume exemptions if a company is located outside the United States and intends to manufacture or import a product and supply it to US customers? What steps are required?
I have been asked this before, so I'm going to couch this with, I'm not 100% confident. I believe the answer is yes, you need to have some US representative. I'm pretty confident that is true. The way you set that up is unclear to me, and that is not something I am well versed in, but I'd say 99% confident you do have to have a US person on this side, obviously, to receive your material, right? And so I believe a lot of companies that are larger just make a US version, a US entity for themselves. And I think other smaller companies might just use agents, but I'm not confident in that. So yes-ish.
Here's the rare opportunity, Alex, where maybe I can answer a question that you can't. So
go for it. Yes, hit us up.
So obviously we've looked at this and engaged with EPA on this. The answer is you do need to have a U.S. entity to, in the case of importation, to be the importer of record, and they're held liable. And in order to submit the PMN, there needs to be a U.S. entity, because basically the U.S. regulatory agency needs to have a U.S. domiciled party that they can touch, right? You can't just import it without a U.S.-based representation, and you can't submit for approval without a U.S. entity making the submission, because they would be the importer or the manufacturer of record. So you do need to have that kind of U.S. entity, and oftentimes the customer is not going to be willing to take on that kind of liability. So non-U.S. based companies almost certainly need to set up a U.S. entity. The good news is, to set up a U.S. based legal entity is relatively easy and inexpensive, if that's important to have that entity there. So let's leave that at that. And then the next question: has the current administration made this regulation a little bit more flexible? And Alex, if you don't mind, I'll just make a couple of comments. There is the authority for the EPA under TSCA to request fees is expiring on the 22nd of June this next year, 2026. And so there is legislative activity taking place right now to rewrite some of the legislation for this regulation. And we, as the Advanced Carbon Council, we are in touch with the committees and the legislative bodies that are going to be writing those rules. So if anybody's interested in that topic, please engage with us, because we are going to be submitting some position papers and engaging with the senators that are going to be writing these rules. The general disposition of the current administration is to reduce regulation wherever possible. So there is a window of opportunity to influence this. And I think I'm going to leave it at that, Alex, because we have other questions and only a few minutes.
Sure.
Well, here's a nice compliment I want to throw out before we finish. This is not a question, but thank you. Honestly, the best and most useful webinar I have ever seen. That is not something we get to hear every day. So thank you for that.
Oh,
yes. The next question is really good. And this is where I also have a question or would love to have you comment on. And that is, we've talked about before, Alex, that, if a material is imported in liquid form, or if it's in an article, which means a physical product that's not further processed or manipulated, those kind of things. So the question is, if graphene is mixed, blended, or used in a final consumer product before, quote unquote, exposure to customer, does it still fall under TSCA? And there's some more questions I'll add on here. So it's a multi-part question. So if it's an article, does it fall under TSCA? What's EPA's definition of raw material? I'm not sure, that maybe raw material versus an article. And then lastly, for a fabric, is it in the fibers, yarn, or cloth, et cetera? So talk about liquid, physical product, articles versus materials.
Yeah, so EPA does have a lot of good guidance on what they consider an article to be, but I would encourage everyone to just think of it fairly intuitively, right? Like, if you're getting something that you don't do almost anything else to, that is probably an article, right? Like, if you get a tennis racket from overseas and that tennis racket has carbon nanotubes in whatever the netting, it's like better for it, you're not further processing that. It came to you as a tennis racket, you're keeping it as a tennis racket, that's an article. There's light manipulations that you can do to a product and have it still be an article, but EPA is pretty specific about that. It'll talk about things like, changing the shape is normally okay, right? But like cutting something, less okay, because they don't want exposure, right? So if you're gonna, roll something, that's a little bit different than, dicing it into, small confettis, for example. So EPA has a lot of examples about that. I definitely encourage that to be looked at. Liquids, powders, pastes, those would not be considered articles because you typically then process them further upon receiving them. And so what your example is that you're gonna, process it, but in a way that has low exposure so that a customer would never be exposed to it. The customer is still getting the article, but you were processing it a little bit in the US. Perhaps one of the exemptions might be a good fit instead of a full PMN, but it would not be an article.
Excellent. Well, Alex, we're at the top of the following hour, so I'm going to conclude this here, but I want to say this to the audience. Regulatory compliance is not an optional item, right? If you want to be in the business of developing, selling, and distributing nanomaterials, these engineered carbons, which have tremendous opportunity and utility, regulatory compliance is simply a cost of doing business that we have to deal with. And that's where the Advanced Carbon Council certainly wants to assist our companies. And that's where Wiley and an expert like Alex can help when you get into the details and you really need some expert assistance. And that's why we thought it would be useful to have this webinar to help educate people and make you aware of what the obligations are to be compliant under regulation, but also different ways that you can approach this that suit your particular business case or stage of development of your company. So with that, I want to say thank you from my side to Alex for joining and providing and sharing her expertise with us. And Alex, do you have any closing comments you want to share with the audience?
I sure do. I just noticed that my email address is wrong. It is alstanton@wiley.law. If you need to find me, you can also find me on Wiley's website.
Well, we'll make sure to send out the corrected version to everybody, and we'll make sure it's clear. So Stanton@Wiley Law.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for hosting, Terrence. I really appreciate it.
No, it's always fun. You're a great resource, and I also appreciate you deliver what can be often complex, arcane information in a way that's easy to understand, and not everybody can say that. So thank you for that.
All right, thanks so much.
Take care.